Welcome to our lesson on the plasma membrane, also known as the cell membrane and cell transport. We're going to begin our lesson by talking about the roles and functions of the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane has three major functions or roles as an organelle within cells, and that is going to be to control or regulate what leaves and enters the cell to cell communication, or what we call cell signaling, and homeostasis. Homeostasis is when cells achieve a balance or equilibrium, which means that it's looking to have a balance of gases, water, and other macromolecules inside and outside of the cell. So that's the goal of homeostasis. And so before we talk about how cells go about achieving homeostasis through cell transport, we need to talk about the phospholipid bilayer. The plasma membrane, or what we call the cell membrane, is composed of a phospholipid bilayer, which means that the plasma membrane has hydrophilic regions called phosphate heads and hydrophobic regions called lipid tails. It's going to be the hydrophilic regions, which are the phosphate heads, that will attract water. Water is polar, and therefore the phosphate heads are polar as well. So not only will the phosphate heads attract water, but it will attract other polar molecules. The lipid tails are considered the hydrophobic region, which is the region of the phospholipid bilayer that will repel water, which means it will push water away. And so because it is pushing water away, it is attracting the nonpolar molecules in the plasma membrane. It is the hydrophobic region of the plasma membrane, which are the lipid tails, that will attract nonpolar molecules across the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane also contains another type of lipid, and that is going to be the cholesterol. Cholesterol is responsible for altering the fluidity of the plasma membrane. So the more cholesterol that you have in the plasma membrane, the less fluidity you're going to have. So the less movement you're going to have in cells as a result of having a lot of cholesterol. And then in reverse, the least amount of cholesterol that you have in your plasma membrane, you're going to increase the fluidity, which means that you're going to have more movement in the cells. And so it's really important that in everyday life that we watch our intake for cholesterol, because if we reduce the fluidity in cells, it can cause things like heart disease. So cholesterol alters or controls or regulates the amount of fluid in cells within the plasma membrane. Another part of the plasma membrane that you need to be familiar with are the types of proteins that you find there. You have something called peripheral proteins, and we have integral proteins. Peripheral proteins are those proteins that are found on the surface of the plasma membrane. That's going to be on the top and the bottom, and they're responsible for cell-to-cell communication. They're very much involved in that process. Then you're going to find something called integral proteins, or protein channels, or carrier proteins. These proteins are those proteins that are actually attached to the plasma membrane. They are embedded in the plasma membrane, and they're responsible for a couple of things. They're responsible for the transport of molecules across the plasma membrane, and they're also responsible for cell-to-cell communication or signaling. And so now we're going to transition and talk about how those molecules actually achieve an equilibrium or homeostasis or balance by way of cell transport. We have two types of cell transport, and that is passive and active transport. Passive transport is going to be the transport or the movement of molecules from a high concentration to a low concentration, or down the concentration gradient, and it requires no energy. Active transport is going to be the transport of molecules from a low concentration to a high concentration, or up the concentration gradient with the help of energy that we call ATP. So active transport requires energy, while passive transport requires no energy. We're going to start with three forms of passive transport, which requires no energy, and molecules are moving from a high concentration to a low concentration down the concentration gradient, which means that we're going to start with simple diffusion. And simple diffusion is going to be the diffusion of molecules from a high concentration to a low concentration, and there's not going to be any energy required. And an example of something or a molecule that would go from a high concentration to a low concentration would be gases like oxygen or carbon dioxide. Another form of passive transport that we need to be familiar with is going to be facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is when molecules move from a high concentration to a low concentration with the help of a protein. And usually this is going to be an integral protein, or what we call a carrier protein, or what we call a channel protein. They're all used interchangeably or one in the same. And so it's going to be molecules moving from a high concentration to a low concentration with the help of a helper protein or a carrier protein, and energy is not required because it's still diffusion, but we're just getting help from a protein. An example of a molecule that would use a protein to cross the plasma membrane is glucose, is sugar. And then we have one last form of diffusion, and that is going to be osmosis. Osmosis is when water molecules are moving across the cell membrane from a high to low concentration. And again, there is no energy required because these are all forms of passive transport, meaning that simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis are all forms of passive transport. They require no energy, and all of the molecules are moving from a high to low concentration. Then we have something called active transport. Active transport is when molecules move across the plasma membrane and they're going from a low concentration to a high concentration. So they are going up the concentration gradient. And they are also getting help from ATP, which is chemical energy, and sometimes there's going to be a protein involved, like a potassium or sodium potassium pump. And so in the sodium potassium pump, for every 3 sodiums that are across the cell membrane, you're going to have 2 potassiums that are going to pass the plasma membrane. Let me say that one more time. For every 3 sodium, which is Na, sodium molecules that pass across the plasma membrane, you're gonna have 2 potassium molecules. That's the K that will cross the plasma membrane. And this is called a sodium potassium pump. It requires ATP or energy for those molecules to cross the plasma membrane, and therefore we call it active transport. So we have 2 forms of cell transport, passive and active. Passive transport requires no energy, while active transport does. So as we continue our lesson on the movement of molecules across the plasma membrane, we have to talk about conditions or environments that cells could possibly placed in for this to happen. And we have 3 conditions or environments that cells can be placed in for there to be movement across the plasma membrane. And that is going to be hypotonic, hypertonic, and isotonic environments or conditions. We're going to start with hypotonic conditions or environments for cells. So when a cell is placed in a hypotonic condition or environment, the concentration of a solute, like salt, something that can be dissolved in water, has a high concentration on the inside of the cell. And guess what water is going to do? It's going to follow the solute. So wherever the highest concentration of solute is, that is where water will go. So in a hypotonic condition or environment for a cell, if the concentration of solute is higher on the inside of the cell, that means that water will move inside the cell. When this happens, the cell will swell or expand. And if we have too much water on the inside of the cell will lyse, Lyse, meaning that the cell will burst. Another condition or environment that cells can be placed in is hypertonic. Hypertonic is when the concentration of solute is higher on the outside of the cell, which means that water always follows the solute. So water will move from the inside of the cell to the outside. And when that happens, the cell will shrink or go through plasmolysis. The cell will shrink or go through plasmolysis when placed in a hypertonic condition or environment, which means that the solute concentration is higher on the outside of the cell than it is on the inside, and water always follows the solute. Therefore, the water is going to move to the outside of the cell as well. The last condition for a cell or environment for the cell is isotonic. Isotonic is when the concentration of solute for a cell is almost or pretty much the same on the inside and outside of the cell. And therefore, you're going to have an equal or almost an equal amount of water on the inside and outside of the cell. So when you think about isotonic, you need to think about the cell has actually achieved homeostasis or an equilibrium or balance. So to wrap it up, there are three conditions for a cell: hypotonic, hypertonic, and isotonic. For any questions related to plasma membrane and cell transport, contact Ms. Piper.